Hello, welcome. My name is Morten Oxenboell. This is the very first episode of our new podcast series in the East Asian Studies Center with the title of Understanding Violence. This is part of an expansive, multi-faceted program that was starting this fall, where faculty will explore the history of collective violence in China, Japan, and Korea. In East Asia, as everywhere, violence and the threat of violence has determined the fates of nations, driven advancements in technology and administration, and spurred doctrinal developments in philosophy and religion. Drawing on sources ranging from ancient myths over medieval war tales to contemporary images of violence, this program will examine the forms of the violence that existed in the lives and minds of the people of East Asia through time. Today's speaker, I'm very honored to welcome Professor Don Wyatt, who is a distinguished professor in history at the Middlebury College. He teaches both Chinese history and philosophy, and his ongoing research includes the histories of traditional intellectualism, violence, and slavery most recently. He's the author of several books and editor of several books. He most recently, his book called Slavery in East Asia, Elements in the Global Middle Ages, speaks directly to what we are going to talk about today on these meanings of violence. But he's also having another volume coming out soon on Song China and the World, which is his area of expertise. So welcome, Professor Wyatt, to Bloomington.
Well, thank you for having me, Professor Oxenboell.
Thank you. So I'm super excited about having you here because your research sounds is fascinating, and I was wondering if you could, just as sort of a little bit of warm up for our listeners, if you could explain a little bit about what your recent book is about. Yes.
Okay. Well, happy to. Slavery in East Asia is about institutionalized slavery in the related East Asian contexts of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam during the broadly construed medieval time frame extending principally from about the year 500 to 1500 of the Common Era. Slavery is, of course, an inherently violent process, but the main premise that emerged through the book, in some ways unanticipated, is that despite all the dissimilarities distinguishing it from its Western counterpart, Western slavery, East Asian slavery was also driven by warfare. Such was really the engine that made it go during the medieval period.
So, for most of us, when we hear about violence, violence is something bad. I think most of us can agree on that. Something that's inappropriate, something to avoid. But I don't think we have to dig very deep to find examples of appropriate violence, the violence that we think is good. For example, law enforcement, which we can argue is not violent because it's law enforcement, but it's still physical acts of harm sometimes. We can also talk about self-defense, certain kinds of sport. I think we have tomorrow an IU football game, so that speaks directly also, I think, to the whole notion of appropriate violence. And in your work, you have written extensively about violence in the form of slavery, but also other types of violence. Do you see a similar ambivalence to violence in pre-modern contexts?
I do concur that most of us find unsanctioned violence against other humans to be bad and impermissible. However, I do think also that we, as moderns, have become conditioned via our latter-day processes of socialization to maintain more constrained views of what properly sanctioned violence is. In other words, we have shed many of the sanctions of the past, such that what was appropriate then is simply not appropriate now.
Right, yes.
To kill someone in the name of religion or because you were convinced that person practiced witchcraft
Right.
was permissible
Yes.
in earlier times. And it simply isn't now. So I think the scope of permissible violence has become narrowed through time.
Right.
The reasons for this are hard to say, but at any rate, it seems to be an actual fact. Also, your question is interesting too, because it's not just humans that this process has affected. In other words, our relationship with animals has changed as well.
Yes.
With regard to this, bear baiting was thought to be a form of sport and actually funny.
Yes.
To our forebears, yeah. But I think most of us now would find that pretty reprehensible.
Yes.
So.
Yes. I mean, you even have people who will go to the extent of saying hunting is a sort of violence, right? But that is still sort of a hotly contested thing.
Yeah, but they're just the indiscriminate killing or victimization of animals is just not. It's just not the thing that.
It's not appropriate.
It's not what you should be doing.
Yeah, it's not what you should be doing. And I kind of like you're using the word sanctioned violence, right? So because sanctioned sort of implies that someone or something made it permissible, right? So there were sanctioned and unsanctioned violence. And as a fellow medievalist, people often have this idea that the medieval period was sort of a free-for-all. Mm-hmm. People could just do wanton acts of violence, mm-hmm. right? But in my own case from medieval Japanese studies, right, it doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. And authority granted sanction to people. As you know from your own work, a samurai offended by a commoner was permitted to essentially cut that person down.
Right. Yes. Right. And yet, not always. They didn't always do it, though. Right. So there's some inhibitors as well. Yes. Right. There's some written sanctions, maybe some legal sanctions that you can or legally sanctioned violence, I should say. And then there are these all sort of more sort of difficult to determine, right? Why did they not then just kill anyone that offended them?
Right.
So that's something I find interesting. There's another thing with the medieval studies and pre-modern studies in general. Many of these societies that we are studying did not have an all-encompassing word for violence, right? They did not group together different kinds of physical aggression into one word that we have today. Like, we all know what violence means until we don't, but medieval societies often did not have a word for violence. Is that something you also experience in your work in medieval China, and if they didn't have a word for violence, does it have any is it meaningful to then compare violence and talk about violence if people back then did not have a concept for it?
Well, this question, this issue seems in many ways related to your prior question, and I guess this issue, it seems to me that the naming of a certain kind of behavior can only happen if that behavior is demonstrated and categorized. And the behavior has to be manifested before it can be sort of put into any kind of typology. Mm. Moreover, I think we have to be mindful that characterizing behavior is always relative. Yeah. And oftentimes must be contrasted with or against behavior that it is not. In other words, it's sort of its opposite.
Yes.
However, you raise a good question regarding how fruitfully we can really get to perceptions of violence in the past. Do we think of the Mongols of Chinggis Khan times as violent? We do. Mm. Did they think of themselves as violent? Perhaps, but very plausibly they didn't.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And I think part of the problem for us is that the past separates us in a way from, not so much from behavior, but from the thought behind the behavior.
Yeah.
So it's hard to discern.
Yes.
In the past.
Right.
And maybe much easier to do so in the present. But you raise a really, this is a tricky conundrum that you've raised.
Right. It's always problematic when we try to figure out what people were thinking.
Yes. Yeah. Someone said to be praying, right?
Yes.
This person was praying in the past. Well, we can't necessarily assume that was a pious act. Right. Maybe this person was praying for the death of his enemies.
Yes. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah. And this whole sort of understanding of what violence means, right? Not only about sort of appropriate violence and sanctioned violence, but also like how did people then see that violent act take place and then in their minds understand. I'm sometimes talking about violence as a language.
Yes.
Right. So what is the message that comes across?
What is the message?
Right. Yes. There's a message. Yeah.
Well, it's consistent with the title of your program, Meanings of Violence.
Right. Yes. Yes. So we hopefully we will get close, or at least we get some thought processes going on. So sort of going back a little bit to my previous questions as well about how people maybe self-sanction violence or think about violence, is that killing people is generally not okay in most societies, in most religions. We know, of course, in Buddhism, you can't kill people, right? That's bad karma. It's not good. And most other religions, Christianity, Islam, it's not okay to kill people. What people do it anyway. Right? They are remarkably capable of finding ways to then say, in this case, it's okay. But going to your research project more specifically, what kind of ethical considerations existed around captivating and enslaving people? Did people have the time at the time have the need to legitimize this kind of violence? And if so, how did they do that?
I don't know if they necessarily had a need to, but in some ways they did, particularly in a culture that became so intensively and extensively slave-dominated as Korea. There were all sorts of legitimations made on the part of the Yangban to kind of justify the practice. And in some ways it's comparable to slavery elsewhere, that somehow the enslaver is affording something to the enslaved that that person would not otherwise possess, and benefit from. It's a specious argument,
Yes.
but
Yes.
all the same, people did do it.
Yeah.
You kind of wonder, was it made to make themselves feel better?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's kind of difficult, right? Yeah. Again, I'm just also thinking the reason why I'm asking this is that in sort of the more widely known kind of slavery of the 18th, 19th centuries, that was sometimes at least coupled up with this notion of bringing enslaved people to God, that kind of, which were like...
Or bringing them civilization.
Bringing them civilization,
yes.
yes.
The same argument that was used against Native Americans.
Exactly, yes.
Or used to basically extirpate them from their normal environments and put them in, like Indian schools and so forth. Yeah.
And of course, one wonders, did they really believe that themselves? When they, or was it just rhetoric, right? And I was kind of of wondering if people in medieval China, medieval Korea, did they have sort of similar notions of, this doesn't look good, we need to find some way of legitimizing that we just like raided a village and captured everyone and now we are shipping them off?
Maybe there are some such self-reflections out there to be had, but I think for the most part, people probably kept what they were really thinking to themselves about
Probably.
this. Did they really believe it, or was it propaganda? And if it was propaganda, who was it for, really?
Right. Yes.
The propagandist or the people who had to suffer through the propaganda?
Yeah.
It's a great. That's a great question, but
not easy to answer.
It's not easy to answer,
No.
And it also assumes a kind of maybe an ethical basis of slavery that maybe was not always present.
There are some more instrumental things in play.
At work here.
We need labor or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And we can't make our enslavers sentimental enslavers. Maybe it was just
business.
Just business.
Yes.
Just money making.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how widespread was it? Like, it's not something we very often hear about, right? We know that they were there. Sometimes we hear Confucian scholars talk a little bit about it, but it's not really a thing that they delve on.
This speaks to my own first training as an intellectual historian. The intellectual record, particularly for China, is largely silent on this issue. Yeah. And it's lamentable, but it says something about the world in which they operated and maybe the invisibility of certain individuals, like slaves.
Yes. Yeah, that kind of leads me to another question. How was the view on slaves in the period that you are the specialist in the Song China? Did they recognize their existence? Or?
Yeah, of course they did, and in fact, in some ways, we have our best sense of numbers of slaves and so forth from that period. Largely because it was so intimately associated with the penal system. So there was a recognition of their existence, but this was an underclass. This was basically a class of undesirables.
Yeah.
And I guess, too, knowledge of them came to the fore largely because, in many ways, certainly Sung times, the Sung dynasty, 10th through 13th centuries, was largely a kind of society in which there was a lot of social leveling. The aristocracy was now gone, and consequently, there is a kind of class consciousness that is widespread and kind of palpable.
Yeah. So, where did these slaves primarily come from? Were they part of, as you say, the penal system?
Yeah.
Were they like Han Chinese, or did they?
They were. There were non-Chinese, but by this time, in the Sung period, they're largely Chinese because of the establishment of this this underclass called basically the class of Jin people, mean or base people.
Right.
And this class probably came to constitute as much as maybe 5% of the overall population. And perhaps about 2% of it was enslaved.
Okay. Wow.
So if you were a slave, you were necessarily a part of that underclass.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a large number. Of course, not as large as we see in Korea around this time as well, where slavery was much more widespread.
Yes, it was rife, up to perhaps exceeding a third of the population.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And we also have slavery in Japan around this time. They don't talk about it very much, but we do see some laws about it in Japan, which is interesting in itself, because they're like, yeah, you can't kidnap people on the road and sell them as slaves. And we're like, okay, so apparently slave trading did happen, but you couldn't have people running around and just catching people.
Well, slavery in Japan seems to have been driven by other factors, largely factors. There was certainly warfare, of course,
yes.
But there were factors of exigency, natural calamities, people impoverished, disease, drought, and so forth. And in that sense, it sort of anticipates slavery in late traditional times in China, where people, due to population growth and a resource base that is shrinking, you see not infrequently, but beginning in early modern times, you see frequently self-enslavement.
Oh, yes. Just to have some sort of sustenance.
Just to survive.
Yeah. All right. So, in my own research, I often speculate about how the notion of appropriate violence, or how people understood violence to be, in some instances, reasonable action to take. That this idea is a cultural, social construct rather than some sort of biological universal, right? As you mentioned in the beginning of our talk here, that today things have changed. Right? We have changed our perception of what constitutes violence and what appropriate aggression looks like, and so that kind of, I think, begs the question of how societies, and in this case, Song China, may have constructed such ideas about, or ideologies about violence. Do you see anything in your sources about this process?
Well, and this is a large component also of what I will be speaking about today. Pre-modern societies constructed broadly shared ideologies of violence largely through processes of ritualization.
Okay.
And there were a number of institutionalized entities that fostered this kind of ritualization. And penal systems is one of those.
Okay.
That people grow to expect sort of normative forms of violence in association with these institutions. And they help to determine how violence responds to violence.
Oh, yes.
In other words, what is the commensurate response to violence?
Yeah.
And that can vary from culture to culture. But that is an area in which I think ritualization plays a key role.
Yes.
In forming attitudes and ideas.
Right, yeah, because it's a sort of a collective reenactment almost sometimes, right, or a celebration, or,
And you see various manifestations of violence along the spectrum from severe to not so severe. For instance, the modern day penal system in Japan is not especially harsh,
no.
I think, but is it rehabilitative, really? And yet there are other cultures where human capital is thought to be redeemable, and consequently the prison system is very much geared toward rehabilitation and a kind of restoration of civil behavior.
Right. Yes.
So it spans the gamut.
Yes. But I like you bringing that up because it's something that seems to provoke some people when they're talking about that incarceration is it's an act of violence.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you are restricting their physical freedom, right, and that is by definition a type of violence. But no, we have to do it, right? So it's again this sort of it's a remedy against further violence.
And certain cultures practice solitary confinement, and others do not.
Right. And medieval Japan did not really have any prisons. It was either you got branded in your forehead, or you got decapitated, or you got a fine.
Right.
You had to pay blood money, for example, right. for a crime, and which is also something that is difficult to sort of wrap your head around today. So that kind of like leads me to my very final question here is what kinds, if any, lessons can modern audience draw from studies of pre-modern violence, slavery? Why should we study these kind of things, in your opinion?
Well, it seems to me the lessons are many, but probably the most prominent among them is the fact that the degrees of separation between ourselves and our ancestors, they're kind of fungible.
Right.
And we can end up being maybe too conceited and too self-satisfied with ourselves if we think we're that divorced from behaviors of the past.
Right.
Also, our connection with the past is sort of subject to fluctuation, and primitivism can pop up, in strange ways in modern places. Right?
Yes.
But I guess the real lesson is that on the one hand, the great civilizing project has made us receptive to ideas that our forebears would have found entirely incomprehensible. Imagine the idea that animals had rights.
Right. Yes.
Or that, there's something called the Geneva Convention.
Right. Yes.
In pre-modern times. No.
That's not how it worked.
But on the other hand, to I guess, reemphasize my initial comment is that the distance between them and us
right.
is not so chasmous as we often like to think.
Right. Yes.
And
yes.
I think by studying their behaviors with respect to violence, it sheds continuously enriching light on our own.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. It kind of reminds me a little bit, if you allow me to digress a little bit, that in European medieval studies have been sort of in some instances hijacked by fascist groups on the internet that sort of celebrates and very far right groups celebrates the kind of medieval masculinity, and that masculinity is manifested in their sort of propensity for acting violently and settling scores violently, and maybe sort of this sort of self-made man, right, self-reliant man idea, I think, and it was something that there's a strong parallel to how the fascism rose in Japan with the idea of the Japanese spirit being sort of the martial spirit, right, that could go in and protect East Asia from itself and from Western colonialism, because the Japanese were just more sort of fit for this modern world of imperialism, right? That was the ideology, at least, and they sort of went back to medieval times, sources from medieval times, and said, this is who we are. This is the true spirit of Japan. And I was just kind of curious. These are like very special instances, of course, but I don't know if you have seen similar examples from China, not the rise of fascism, of course, but if in modern times you have this sort of idealization of...
Yes, of course, a kind of nativization, a kind of looking back to some sort of primeval common culture that may be imaginary or what have you.
Yes.
But yeah, there is this instances of this sort of behavior, I guess, or certainly this sort of thinking. But
it's a hard one,
yeah, it's a tough one
Yeah.
from a violence standpoint,
Right.
largely because the instance that I'm most familiar with, again, the Song China situation, was looking back to a sort of common culture that was viewed as largely civilian, and had somehow become almost an apogee of the civilizing process, from which, you know, people had sort of like gone astray and fallen away from, but were now working to return to.
Yeah.
But
is that this Wenwu binary that you're referring to here?
well, there is that, but
which is for readers who don't know, that is sort of the civil versus martial
versus the martial.
Yes.
Yeah, there is that, but a lot of it too was in the realm of thought and trying to reconstitute a sort of native ideal of the intellectual, largely in response to Buddhism.
Oh yeah.
And trying to recreate a sort of idealized culture of the past.
Yeah.
That had native characteristics.
Right. Yes. Well, I could sit here all day, Professor Wyatt, and talk violence. I think this has been extremely stimulating and fascinating.
Well, Professor Oxenboell, thank you for the opportunity to converse on these subjects. It's been enlightening and certainly a deserving set of issues to be explored. And let's hope it's really only the beginning.
Yes, let's hope that. I appreciate your words, and let's see if we can find another time when we can sit down and talk more violence.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Okay.